Few people notice this detail. We walk through the world convinced that we are the architects of our destinies, the masters of our intellectual domains, and the captains of our moral souls. Yet we are perpetually tethered to a biological engine that is slowly, relentlessly, and indifferently breaking down. This is the staggering premise of David Salay's Flesh, a narrative that functions less like a novel and more like a high-velocity autopsy of the modern man. It is a story that strips away the veneer of civilization to reveal the raw, pulsing, and eventually rotting reality of our physical existence. The protagonist, Paul, is the archetypal consumer of life, a man who views the world as a vast buffet of sensations, transactions, and acquisitions. In the beginning, we see him in the full flush of his powers, a successful businessman navigating the high-stakes world of finance and property. He is a man of appetite. He moves through the streets of London and the boardrooms of Europe with a predatory grace, convinced that his wealth and his willpower can insulate him from the common fate of the masses. He is the materialist king, believing that if he can just buy enough pleasure, consume enough fine wine, and possess enough bodies, he can outrun the encroaching shadow of his own mortality. The narrative arc begins with a sensational display of excess. Paul is a man who measures his worth by the quality of the flesh he surrounds himself with. Whether it is the marble steak on his plate or the smooth skin of the women he pays for, everything is a commodity to be devoured. This is the archetype of the predatory ego, the part of the psyche that seeks to fill an internal void with external substance. But Salay's prose is not romantic, it is clinical and merciless. He describes Paul's world with a biological precision that makes the reader feel the grease on the lips and the sweat on the brow. As Paul's business empire begins to show its first hairline fractures, we see the psychological mirroring of his physical self. The stress manifests not as a noble struggle, but as a thickening of the waist, a shortness of breath, and a creeping sense of lethargy. This is the first fall of the flesh. The lesson here is the illusion of material insulation. We are being provoked to realize that no amount of social status or financial success can alter the fact that we are, at our core, biological entities subject to the laws of entropy. Paul's wealth is merely a temporary mask for his fragility. And as the mask slips, the horror of his own banality begins to emerge. The story intensifies as Paul's financial ruin accelerates. He is no longer the hunter, he is the hunted. Debt, like a parasite, begins to feed on his peace of mind. But the narrative refuses to grant him the dignity of a spiritual crisis. Instead, Salay keeps us trapped within Paul's physical sensations. We feel the claustrophobia of a man who can no longer afford the luxuries that once defined him. He retreats into a world of cheaper pleasures. Yet his appetites remain undiminished, becoming grotesque in their lack of refinement. This is the archetype of the desperate animal. When the refined flesh is no longer available, the man will settle for the raw and the ragged. Paul's interactions with women become increasingly transactional and hollow, a desperate attempt to reaffirm his existence through the only language he knows, the tactile, the carnal, and the immediate. The psychological analysis of this stage reveals the void of nihilism. When a man defines himself solely through what he can touch and consume, the loss of his purchasing power is equivalent to the loss of his soul. Paul is not losing his money, he is losing his self, because he never built a self that existed outside of the marketplace. Analyze the visceral lesson of biological realism. Salay is forcing us to confront the shadow of the body. In most literature, the body is a vehicle for the heart or the mind. But in Flesh, the body is the master. We see Paul grappling with the indignities of middle age, the mind aches that become chronic pains, the digestive betrayals, the way the mirror becomes an enemy. This is a sensational departure from the heroic journey. There is no wisdom gained through suffering here, there is only the exhaustion of a machine that has been run too hard for too long. The lesson is one of existential humility. We are being told that we are not the stories we tell ourselves, we are the meat that carries those stories. Paul's decline is a slow-motion car crash of the ego, a reminder that the flesh is a demanding, ungrateful God that eventually fails its worshippers. We are overlookers of this fundamental truth, that our intellectual and emotional lives are entirely dependent on the chemical stability of a body that is designed to fail. The narrative flow then moves into the purgatory of the mundane. Paul, stripped of his grandiosity, finds himself in a series of bleak apartments and fading hotel rooms. The sensationalism of his earlier life is replaced by the sensationalism of decay. Szalay focuses on the texture of the world, the stained carpets, the smell of old cooking oil, the grey light of a Tuesday afternoon. Paul is now a man in a state of biological suspense. He is waiting for something to happen. Yet he has lost the agency to make anything happen. He is the archetype of the passive observer, watching his own life unfold with a detached, clinical horror. He becomes obsessed with his own health, not out of a desire for longevity, but out of a fear of the pain that his flesh can inflict upon him. The narrative intensity builds as he faces a health crisis, a potential heart issue or the onset of a debilitating disease. This is the ultimate confrontation. The man who once used his body as a weapon of pleasure must now experience it as a prison of pain. The psychological depth here is found in the total isolation of the body. When we are in pain, we are truly alone, no one can share the sensation of our own nerves firing. And Paul, who never cultivated deep emotional connections, finds himself in a desert of his own making. This segment of the story analyzes the fragility of the masculine identity. Paul's sense of manhood was entirely tied to his ability to dominate, financially, socially, and sexually. As his flesh fails him, his identity collapses into a heap of resentment and confusion. He looks at younger men with a mixture of envy and hatred, seeing in them the vitality he once possessed and the arrogance he once wore like a suit of armor. He is the overtaken king, forced to watch as the world moves on without him. The narrative demands that we look at the obsolescence of the material man. If we do not develop a spiritual or intellectual core, we are destined to become relics the moment our biological peak has passed. Paul is a ghost haunted by his own former appetites. The sensational tragedy is not that he is dying, but that he is living in a body that has become a stranger to him. The lesson is one of internal cultivation, the desperate need to find a purpose that is not anchored in the transient pleasures of the skin. As the narrative momentum carries us toward the final stages of Paul's journey, the prose becomes even more sparse and cutting. We see him attempting to find comfort in the familiar. Yet everything has been tainted by his new perspective. Food no longer tastes like luxury, it tastes like fuel. Tingduk no new no longer feels like conquest, it feels like a chore of the nervous system. He has achieved a state of post-hedonic despair. He had seen through the illusion of the flesh and found nothing on the other side. This is the void of the atheist soul. A man who has rejected the transcendental and is now faced with the cold, hard vacuum of a purely physical universe. The sensational power of Salay's writing lies in his refusal to blink. He does not offer Paul a moment of grace or a sudden epiphany. He simply records the friction of existence. The lesson we are learning is the necessity of the transcendental. Without a connection to something larger than ourselves, be it art, love, or faith, the decay of the flesh is an unmitigated disaster. Paul is a warning to every modern seeker who believes that the good life is found in the accumulation of experiences. He shows us that experiences, once consumed, leave nothing behind but the hunger for more. Until the body is too tired to eat, the story moves into its penultimate phase, where the shattering of the social mask is complete. Paul no longer cares about appearances. He is the archetypal unfiltered man, his internal rot finally reaching the surface. His interactions with others become blunt, almost animalistic in their honesty. He has lost the energy required for the performance of civility. This is the anarchy of the soul, where the rules of society are discarded because the flesh no longer sees the point in following them. The psychological analysis of this state reveals a cynical freedom. There is a certain power in having nothing left to lose. But for Paul, it is a hollow power. He is free from expectation, but he is also free from hope. The narrative flow becomes a stream of biological consciousness, where the pulses of the heart and the pangs of the stomach are the only landmarks left. We are being pulled into the gravitational well of the material, where everything, love, ambition, memory, is being crushed by the weight of the physical present. The purgatory of the mundane deepens as the narrative shifts from the external ruin of Paul's business to the internal collapse of his biological sanctuary. We are witnessing the archetypal exile of the senses, where the very world Paul once dominated through sheer force of appetite begins to recede into a grey, inaccessible distance. The sensationalism of his earlier life, the clinking of crystal, the roar of foreign engines, the heat of illicit skin, is replaced by the sensationalism of the cellular. Szalay focuses on the texture of the world with a microscope that reveals only the filth, the stained carpets of a transient apartment, the smell of old cooking oil clinging to the curtains, the grey, particulate light of a Tuesday afternoon that offers no promise of a Wednesday. Paul is now a man in a state of biological suspense. He is waiting for something to happen. Yet he has lost the agency to make anything happen. He is the archetype of the passive observer, watching his own life unfold with a detached, clinical horror, realizing that his body is no longer his loyal servant but a treacherous landlord demanding a rent he can no longer pay. The story intensifies as the focus turns toward the treachery of the vessel. Paul becomes obsessed with his own health, not out of a noble desire for longevity, but out of a visceral, animalistic fear of the pain that his flesh can inflict upon him. The narrative intensity builds as he faces a health crisis, the sudden, sharp reminder of a heart that has been pushed too hard by stress and luxury. This is the ultimate confrontation. The man who once used his body as a weapon of pleasure must now experience it as a prison of pain. The psychological depth here is found in the total isolation of the body. When we are in pain, we are truly alone. No one can share the sensation of our own nerves firing. And Paul, who never cultivated deep emotional connections, finds himself in a desert of his own making. He realizes that the people he owned were merely ghosts, and in the silence of the hospital corridor, the only thing that is real is the throb of his own pulse. The lesson here is the bankruptcy of the hedonist. When the body stops being a source of joy and becomes a source of agony, the man who has nothing else is left with a deficit of the soul that no bank can ever cover. Analyze the fragility of the masculine identity through the lens of physical decay. Paul's sense of manhood was entirely tied to his ability to dominate, financially, socially, and sexually. As his flesh fails him, his identity collapses into a heap of resentment and confusion. He looks at younger men with a mixture of envy and hatred, seeing in them the vitality he once possessed and the arrogance he once wore like a suit of armor. He is the overtaken king, forced to watch as the world moves on without him, indifferent to his former glories. The narrative demands that we look at the obsolescence of the material man. If we do not develop a spiritual or intellectual core, we are destined to become relics the moment our biological peak has passed. Paul is a ghost haunted by his own former appetites. A sensational tragedy not because he is dying, but because he is living in a body that has become a stranger to him. The lesson is one of internal cultivation, the desperate need to find a purpose that is not anchored in the transient pleasures of the skin. Without a life of the mind, the death of the body is the death of everything. The narrative flow moves into the winter of the instincts. We see Paul attempting to find comfort in the familiar, yet everything has been tainted by his new perspective. Food no longer tastes like luxury, it tastes like fuel for a failing engine. Sexual intimacy no longer feels like conquest, it feels like a chore of the nervous system, a mechanical act devoid of the spark of life. He has achieved a state of post-hedonic despair. He had seen through the illusion of the flesh and found nothing on the other side. This is the void of the atheist soul. A man who has rejected the transcendental and is now faced with the cold, hard vacuum of a purely physical universe. The sensational power of Szalay's writing lies in his refusal to blink or offer a sentimental exit. He simply records the friction of existence, the sound of feet dragging on pavement, the labored breath of a man walking up a flight of stairs. The lesson we are learning is the necessity of the transcendental. Without a connection to something larger than ourselves, the decay of the flesh is an unmitigated disaster that renders every previous pleasure a mockery. As Paul drifts through the wreckage of his social standing, we witness the shattering of the social mask. He no longer cares about appearances because he no longer believes in the world of appearances. He is the archetypal unfiltered man, his internal rot finally reaching the surface in his interactions with others. He becomes blunt, almost animalistic in his honesty, having lost the energy required for the performance of civility. This is the anarchy of the soul, where the rules of society are discarded because the flesh no longer sees the point in following them. The psychological analysis of this state reveals a cynical freedom. There is a certain power in having nothing left to lose. But for Paul, it is a hollow power, a freedom that leads only to a deeper isolation. He is free from expectation, but he is also free from hope. Drifting in a stream of biological consciousness where the pulses of the heart and the pangs of the stomach are the only landmarks left, the narrative intensity shifts toward the metaphysics of the gutter. Paul finds himself in the company of those he would have once looked down upon, the broken, the addicted, the marginalized. In these fringe spaces, the flesh is seen for what it truly is, a fragile, temporary home. He observes the decay in others and sees his own reflection. There is a sensational, dark brotherhood in this shared mortality. He realizes that the billionaire and the beggar are made of the same combustible material. This is the leveling of the human condition. The story is pulling us into the gravitational well of the material, where everything, love, ambition, memory, is being crushed by the weight of the physical present. Paul's journey is the reverse of a spiritual ascent, it is a descent into the molecular, where the only truth left is the fact of his own breathing. He is being stripped of every illusion until he is nothing more than a nervous system reacting to a cold environment. The lesson of total embodiment becomes clear as the narrative nears its final movement. We often think of ourselves as something separate from our body, a ghost in the machine. But Paul is discovering that the machine is the ghost. When the body suffers, the mind suffers. When the body fails, the mind ceases to function. This biological determinism is the most terrifying aspect of the book. It suggests that our highest thoughts and our deepest loves are merely byproducts of a specific arrangement of flesh. As Paul's arrangement begins to change, his reality changes. He loses his grip on the narrative of his life because the author, his body, is losing interest in the story. This is the sensational silence of the void. We are forced to ask, if we are only flesh, then what is the meaning of the struggle? The narrative doesn't answer, it only shows us the struggle. The momentum carries us into the final autumn, where Paul's physical environment mirrors his internal stagnation. He walks through the parks of London, watching the leaves rot in the damp earth, and he understands that he is no different from the vegetation. He has been harvested by time. The psychological depth here is found in the acceptance of the animal. Paul finally stops fighting his decline and starts to inhabit it. He accepts his hunger, his pain, and his weariness as the only honest parts of his existence. This honesty of the body is a dark, heavy gold. It is the only thing he has left after the lead of his ego has been burned away by the fires of failure. He is no longer the materialist king, but the biological subject, waiting for the final decree of the laws of nature. The final movement of this anatomical narrative enters the winter of the integrated void, where the distinction between the man and his decay completely dissolves. We are overlooking the most important thing. The flesh is not just the vessel of the story, it is the story itself. Paul has reached the rubedo of his biological descent, a state of raw, red honesty where the social mask has not just slipped, but has been flayed away by the friction of existence. In the earlier chapters, his life was a sensational display of possession-owning property, owning women, owning his own health. But as he stands in the cold, great twilight of his timeline, he has moved into a state of dispossession. He is being reclaimed by the very elements he once thought he could buy and sell. The psychological depth of this stage is the ego death of the animal. He no longer thinks of himself as Paul the businessman or Paul the lover. He is simply a biological unit experiencing the sensation of the wind on his face and the dull, persistent ache in his chest. The narrative reaches its most provocative peak in the total surrender to the biological. Paul finds himself sitting on a park bench, watching a younger couple in the distance. In their laughter and their tactile closeness, he does not see romance, he sees the alchemical heat of a machine that hasn't started to rust yet. He sees the flesh in its arrogant peak, unaware of the inevitable entropy that is already encoded in its cells. This is the vision of the mortal master. He knows what they do not, that every kiss is a transaction with time, and every surge of vitality is a loan that will be called in with interest. The sensational reality of his perspective is that he is finally free. But it is a freedom that feels like a burial. He is free from the lust for life because life has lost its luster. He has achieved a biological stoicism, not a philosophical choice, but a physical necessity, and lies the ultimate meaning that szalay intends to convey. Flesh is radical confrontation with our own biological nihilism. The book's core message is that we are living in a dream world of our own construction, built out of the lead of our social status and intellectual vanity. The reality is that we are meat with a memory. Paul's journey is the process of the memory fading as the meat fails. The book serves as a psychological memento mori, a reminder that our highest aspirations and our deepest shames are all contingent upon the functioning of a heart that will eventually stop beating. It teaches us that the self is a fragile consensus between billions of cells, and when that consensus breaks down, the I disappears. The climax of the story is the sanctuary of the breath. In the final pages, Paul is reduced to the most basic units of existence. He focuses on the rhythm of his own breathing, the in and the out, the only thing he truly owns and the only thing he has left to lose. The sensational power of this ending lies in its heavy peace. There is no redemption, no light at the end of the tunnel, and no reconciliation with his past. There is only the fact of being. He has moved from the search for external validation to the sovereignty of the biological present. He is at home in his own skin, even as that skin sags and fails him. He has integrated the shadow of the body, realizing that he was never anything more, and never anything less, than the very flesh he once tried to escape. When the money, the youth, and the vanity are gone, the only thing that remains is the cold, honest fact of your own heartbeat.